Hey everybody, I am going to talk to you briefly about some nonverbal communication skills. Just as a heads up, this is going to be a short lecture, shorter than what we would go over in class. So I'm going to pose a couple questions to you to think about. And I would encourage you to, instead of posting those into a discussion board on Blackboard, maybe sharing them in the Discord. All right, so first, let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right. So, the first portion of what we talked about earlier this week was really all about verbal communication. We spent a lot of time talking about the theory, symbolic interaction theory, which I absolutely love. I think it's a super cool theory. It's a really cool way to think about how communication influences all these different parts of our lives. Well, nonverbal communication is probably even more important than the verbal communication that we use on a daily basis because it's all about how we say things and communicating without words and communicating by look and context. And nonverbal communication is just a huge part of how we communicate in our lives. It can serve as a substitute for verbal communication, meaning that it takes the place of what you might say. So let's say somebody says, are you, doing, how are you doing today? You could give a thumbs up or like an okay symbol or something like that. That's going to substitute for actually saying the words okay. Complimenting could be something that actually boosts the verbal communication that you're giving. So again, you could say, how's it going today? And somebody's like, great. Okay, well, the thumbs up in that instance is a compliment to the answer, the verbal answer, great. Contradiction, though, would be where your nonverbals actually give the opposite impression of what it is that you are saying verbally. So, how are you doing today? I'm fine. The words I'm fine, may sound like, oh, okay, that person's doing well. Whereas their facial expressions, their tone of voice actually contradict that, right? So nonverbals can do lots of things to help us understand communication. My kids last night, my youngest, my 4-year-old Liam, he was like, "Hey, mom, can I, watch this movie?" And I was like, "Fine." And he took it at face value. He was like, "Great, mom's not mad at me. She said I can watch TV." And my daughter, who's 8, chimes up. She was like, "Liam, that's sarcasm." So, it helped her help him in the moment to understand that there was more going on than just the verbal message that was being sent. So nonverbal communication is really important. It does all these extra things. It also helps us manage how we participate in the conversation, whether we're active, whether we're not, whether we're disengaged. I think of times that I've looked at students and thought, man, what I'm talking about sure doesn't feel very exciting to them right now based on how they're participating in the conversation. Let's talk a little bit more about proxemics. Now, this is a part of nonverbal communication that refers to how close you are to another person. When we think about personal space, typically everybody's got their own sense of comfort with how close somebody else can be to them. And depending on your relationship with that person, depends on how close they can come into your personal space. So there's 4 different levels of this. One is, I guess, the closest, most, physically close space that you would allow somebody else is an intimate space. This is intimacy. This is physical intimacy. These are the things that you hear about and think about, whenever you might think of like kissing or having sex or something like that, or even just being someone who can sit on your lap or cuddle with you or whatever. That is physical intimacy. That is the intimate space of proxemics. A little bit further out of that is personal. I would talk about personal space and say, to my kids, let's say if they tried to climb into my lap whenever I was working on my laptop, I'd say, hey, you're in my personal space right now, and I don't need you there. That is a little bit bigger. They're not in the intimate space with me. They might want to cuddle next to me on the couch. They might, hold my hand or whatever, but it's not an intimate level of, very, very, very close to the person. So again, we're spreading out just a little bit further. After that is a social space. This is something where your friends and family and maybe coworkers, are allowed into that bubble of personal space. And that could be standing a few feet apart from each other, but close enough to be able to really like engage with each other and see each other's facial expressions. Let's say within that 6 feet of social distancing, right? That's our social space. Now, public, that's going to be your social distancing and beyond. You don't want people that you don't know. This is the general public. You want them out of that space. I think about times that I'm in line at the grocery store and somebody creeps up behind me. Whew, I get so uncomfortable and it makes me so mad. It's definitely a pet peeve of mine because they're invading my personal space and I don't like it. That is the public level. So all of these different levels of space matter. And it's important that we understand each other's nonverbals to know what is an acceptable, proxemic level that you can really get into with that person's permission. This is something that does relate to public speaking. It's not just your interpersonal interactions, but public speaking as well. Think about there may be some situations as a speaker where you're very far away from your audience and that feels weird. You might want to try to close that gap some. Similarly, you don't want to be right up in your audience's personal space. So figuring out what is an appropriate distance, typically the public. Sometimes if it's a smaller room or a smaller group, a social space might be acceptable. But generally speaking, we're talking about public. I want to briefly discuss the expectancy violations theory with you. I believe, talked about in this chapter. It is a great theory to talk about nonverbal communication. It also relates to verbal communication. So just keep that in mind while I'm discussing it tonight. This theory is really all about how our expectations affect communication and what we think people will do and how we will respond to them. So what we think you're going to do will potentially drive how we communicate into a situation. For example, if I were to say to you, thank you, I have an expectation that in return, you will say, you're welcome. That is an expectation I have. If I say thank you to you and you don't say it, I have a response in my mind or maybe out loud. I might say like, oh, is everything okay? Are you having a bad day? Or maybe I might say it again thinking you didn't hear it. Or I might not say anything and think, gosh, why is, so-and-so mad at me tonight? So it's all about what that expectation is. And if our expectations are not met, if they are violated, then we have, a response to that. Basically, boiling it down, all of our expectations drive how we interact with other people. Think about it this way. You won't propose to your significant other if you think that they're going to say no. You will propose to them because you expect them to say yes, and therefore that drives your interaction, that drives your ability to decide to propose. And this is something that we learn over time. Maybe you think your significant other wants to get married or will say yes to your proposal because they've communicated things like, boy, I'd sure love to marry you one day in the past. Maybe you think that, well, this is, we've been together for 5 years and it seems like it's the right time because people who stay together for a while tend to get married. That's a learned expectation. You may also learn different expectations based on trial and error. For example, if I wake up my kids too late in the morning, I can expect that they will be cranky because I'm going to rush them. But if I wake them up too early in the morning, they will be cranky because they haven't gotten enough sleep. And so I have learned to expect certain behaviors based on what time of the morning I wake them up. This has been a trial and error, lots of repetition involved in figuring out what works for them and what keeps me from, pulling my hair out in the morning. But we learn these experiences and these expectations, and that's what allows us to then predict how people will respond. So I've talked a lot about some verbal communication here, but we would also say that this applies to nonverbals as well. We might expect strangers to keep a public bubble, public space, right? Distance at a public space. If they, don't keep that space, again, that would be a violation of our expectation. Think about a time that your expectations were violated. And what did you do? How did you react? I would love to see some thoughts on this in our class Discord. You can go to the Discord chat and you're added into the Comm 1113 group. But tell me, what is something that happened to you, and how did you react? So I have this little adorable picture of a person who was, supposed to be bringing their kid to work, and you might think based on, oh, it's bring your kid to work day. That would be a human child, but in this instance, it's a cat child, a very cute one too. Um, for me, I can think of some nonverbal times that my expectations were not met or were violated. Uh, Anytime somebody gets on the elevator with me and stands too close, that's definitely a weird one. Sometimes, like I mentioned, if I'm in the store checking out and somebody gets close to my shopping cart, that's a violation. Another time would be if I go in to give Dustin a hug and a kiss and he leans away. That's an expectation that's violated. Um, he's clearly listening in the other room. So just a couple of examples, but think about how this might have played out in your life as well. We can have positive experiences and we can have negative experiences from these violations. It's called positive valence, negative valence. So if somebody does something unexpected and it's good, it makes you feel happy, that's a positive. If I expect my children to be cranky monsters, if I wake them up too early and I wake them up too early and they're great, that's a positive valence. If I expect my husband to give me a kiss whenever he comes home from work and he doesn't, that would make me feel bad and it would be a negative valence. So, there's ways that this can play out. This is a really fun theory to think about, and I would challenge you to think about how this is relevant to your own interpersonal relationships. One more thing to discuss with you before we wrap up today. There are several different kinds of ways to communicate nonverbally. These are nonverbal codes. And some of these relate to your public speaking experience, but they may also relate to just your general communication exchanges on a daily basis. Appearance is a big one. How you look and what you wear does communicate things nonverbally. We talked about that early in the semester. I walked around the room and said, well, what do you think based on the clothes I have on? What are the things that you would expect to be true of me? What am I communicating nonverbally? So coming in prepared with your hair fixed and looking nice and professional, positive nonverbal communication. We already mentioned proxemics. That again is your use of space and how close you are to another person. Body movement, gestures, posture, these are all different kinds of physical, nonverbal communication. So when you move around the room, if you are shaking your legs anxiously, if you are bouncing up and down or whatever, gestures, using your hands. I clearly use a lot of gestures whenever I speak. Posture is a big one too. Standing up straight and tall is good. It's typically valued positively in our culture. I can tell too whenever I almost expect my very tall students to kind of lean over a little bit whenever they give a presentation because that's what they're used to doing. But I love to see people stand tall. So how does that communicate? What does that say about you? Or what is it communicating to somebody else about you? Vocals is one that we tend to associate as a verbal form of communication, but it's technically nonverbal. So is there excitement in your voice? Are you sad? Are you loud? Are you soft? Are you shaky? Your voice is shaking. All of those are different kinds of ways to communicate tone, which is a nonverbal form of communication. It's not the words you're saying, it's how you're saying it. Eye contact is a big one in our culture. Eye contact shows confidence and it shows certainty. In some cultures, it can be disrespectful. So just be aware of what those, for all of these different nonverbal codes, be aware of what the expectations are of the culture that you're in. Touch, physically touching people, handshakes, holding hands, walking arm in arm, putting your arm around someone, maybe touching their face. Ugh, please don't. Uh, all these different ways that we can touch each other, say different things about, our relationships with each other. We've got facial expressions. So smiles and frowns and big eyes and squinty eyes or whatever. Those are all different kinds of facial expressions that you might use or see to communicate different emotions. Now there's a field of study in communication that's growing more, but it's called micro expressions. And this would be something that might be useful if you're interested in going into any kind of police work. These are very small, minute changes in the face. I feel like I got to take off my glasses here, where there's maybe just a little tiny changing of your face that would communicate something you're thinking. So there's a video that I'm posting to Blackboard too that talks a little bit about that. It talks more just in general about nonverbal communication and how that's used. That might be of interest for you. Last but not least, the physical environment that you're in. Think about this. If you go on a date and you go over to your, partner's house or whatever, and they've got the lights low and there's music on, that's a physical environment, but it is communicating nonverbally to you. Like, hey, it's romantic time. Versus you go over to their house and all the lights are on and people are over and it's a party. Maybe that's just more of a fun hang versus a one-on-one alone romantic time. So that is all that I have for our PowerPoint today. Like I said, I'm looking forward to hearing from you, your thoughts, casually, kind of sharing them in the Discord with each other. And I appreciate everybody's flexibility this week. We will have our presentations for the introduction speech. We'll do interviews and the speeches on Friday. So make sure to show up early and on time. I'll partner everybody up and then we'll break out and do our speeches and it'll be great. I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody and seeing you all then. Have a good one.